Welcome to Tribecast, guys. Today we will be having a session with Christine. And before starting, a huge shout out to Browser Stack, our exclusive sponsor for all our community events and premier sponsor for all our conferences. Now, about our speaker today, Christine. She is working as a principal engineer of software testing at a company named as Velocity. She is also an author. She have written a book named as The Complete Software Tester. Okay, I'll call her up on the stage right now. Just a second. Hey, Christine.
Hello,
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm great. I'm great. I'm excited for your session. Can you just give us a brief, uh, about what you're going to talk about today?
Yes, absolutely. Over the last 15 months, I've been working at a big project at my company where we were rewriting our mobile app, and it presented a lot of testing challenges. So, what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about the steps that we took to create a testing plan for this project. So, hopefully, as I'm describing it, the listeners will be able to come up with ideas for their own teams when they have their own complicated testing project.
Okay, perfect. Just a second. I'll be sharing the screen.
Okay. Okay, a little bit about me before we get started. As it was already mentioned, I'm a principal engineer 3 for software testing at Paylocity. I'm the author of the book, The Complete Software Tester. I've also created a YouTube show called Monday Morning Automation that is on YouTube every Mondays, obviously. I have a LinkedIn learning course called Postman Essential Training, and I'm a blogger at my blog called Think Like a Tester. Yeah, that's it about me. Next slide. Okay, so the first step in any complicated testing project is to understand the problem. So next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit about what Paylocity does so that you can understand what our project was going to entail. Paylocity is an HR and payroll company, so we have lots of customers who sign up to use our service, and they use our service to get paid to pay their employees, to manage their employees' time, and so on. So we've got features like time and labor management, which includes things like clocking in and out, also known as punching. I'll be talking about punching a lot today. Requesting time off, managing work schedules. We also have a chat feature so that coworkers can communicate with each other. We have a community feature so that teams can stay in touch. Then we've got other features like benefits, training, expense tracking, and we have both a web app and a mobile app for this purpose. So it's a really big application that does a lot of things. Okay, next slide. So we wanted to rewrite our mobile app, and this was why. Our mobile app was buggy and it was hard to maintain. It was written in Ionic, which is a development framework where you write once and then it works in both Android and in iOS. But because of that framework, there were often a number of dependencies that were changing. So that, oftentimes we would have to like make sure to do an upgrade and make sure that everything still worked. And then we also have, because it's such a big app, we have many feature teams that contribute code to the application. And then that made it very difficult to coordinate testing. So our plan was that we were going to rewrite the app in native code. We weren't going to be able to rewrite the whole thing all at once, though, because it was such a massive application. So what we were going to do is we were going to write some features in native, like, logging in, the main menus, navigation, things like that. And then there were going to be some features that were going to still be in Ionic, but those would be presented in the mobile app through what was called portals. And so we hired new software teams that were skilled in Android and iOS native development to do this work. Okay, next slide. So we had some risks associated with the project. The first one was that we were initially only given 1 year to complete the project. It became clear after about 6 months that it was not going to get done in 1 year. So then we had 15 months, but we were always under a very big time crunch. And then I also mentioned that because we didn't have time to rewrite everything, some of the features were still going to be in Ionic. So we were going to have to test native features and Ionic features. The developers that we hired to do the native work were really awesome, very talented, but they didn't know our product. So we had to make sure that we were communicating all of the information about our features and how they work to the developers. And then we had 25 feature teams that all had at least one page in the mobile app. And some of those features had complicated business logic that few team members understood, sometimes not even the people on the actual team. So we needed to make sure that we were understanding what all the business rules were. And then we also had the existing Ionic mobile team who needed to make sure that we were keeping the lights on for the current app, because it wasn't like we were going to shut down the old app while we were making the new app. We had to keep the current app going and make sure that if any bugs were found through the course of those 15 months, that those were fixed and deployed. Okay, next slide. So for part two, we focused on staffing. Next slide. So we needed to assemble a software test team. We only had 3 testers, and that was including myself, who was managing the testing project. So we were definitely going to need more testers for this big effort. Our mobile director asked if we could hire 4 more testers, but because of budget constraints, we did not get 4 more testers. We were allowed to hire 1 permanent tester, and then we were allowed to hire 2 contractors just for a 6-month period. As it turned out, one of the contractors that we hired was really wonderful. And so I started saying right away, we need to hire this guy permanently. And I complained loudly enough for long enough that they hired him. And now he is a permanent member, and I'm really happy to have him. We had another contractor who did not work out so well, got more of a 50% effort from her. So at the end of the contract, we let her contract lapse, but we were actually able to get 2 full-time testers out of this. We were told that we could borrow testers from other teams and that they could help us part-time. This did not work at all. We borrowed 2 testers who were supposed to be helping us 50% of the time. They were so busy on their own teams, and they always prioritized that work. So they basically did nothing. So that was not helpful. When it became apparent that that was not helpful, we were allowed to permanently get someone from another team, transferred from a different team. And that was extremely helpful because we were able to get someone from another team who had a lot of experience and knew the product really well. So that was very beneficial. Okay, next slide. So next was organizing the test team. My original vision was I wanted to make sure that everyone in the test team had a chance to work on each different part of the application. That was a great idea, but it didn't pan out so well because we were under the gun. We had so many things to get done so quickly that it quickly became clear that we needed to sort of have every person be an expert in their own area and continue in that way. So we had 1 tester who was working on the keeping the lights on with the current application, making sure that the releases were coming out every month and checking any existing bugs. We had 1 tester who was testing the Ionic elements that were going to be in those portals, making sure that they worked when they were in the portals. And also there was a little bit of a UI refresh, so it matched the rest of the app. So he was testing those things too. We had 1 tester who was testing the backend API. We had a new backend API that was calling some of the older APIs. So not only did he test that, but he also wrote automation for that, which was extremely helpful. We had 1 tester testing the Android native application, 2 testers working on the iOS native application, and then I was helping out wherever needed. Like sometimes if we had a lot of testing to do, I would jump in and I would start taking stories. Okay, next slide. So the next step was tooling. We had to figure out what tools we were going to use to run all of our tests. So next slide. So the first thing we wanted to do was we wanted people to have test devices in hand. So because we are a remote company, we don't have at the office a device farm that anybody can borrow from. So that meant that our testers needed to have test devices of their own at home that they could use for testing. So we made sure that every tester on the team had one Android device and one iOS device for testing. Unfortunately, the contractors did not get test devices. And so that slowed down our testing process a little bit because there were some features that could only be tested with a device in hand. For example, doing a punch when the user is offline, we needed to make sure that people had devices in hand for that. But we made sure that different operating systems were represented. One of the things that I did was I kept my iOS device at iOS 15 so that we could always test those, and we found some pretty good bugs with that. Unfortunately, just last week, I left my iOS device plugged in and it upgraded on me. So now my device is iOS 16. But we did have for a while, we had iOS 15 and 16, and then we had Android 13 and 12. And then there were a couple of testers on other feature teams who had their feature had a lot of mobile presence. For example, like the time off team and the punch team. So we let testers from those teams each have a test device as well. Okay, next slide. So for everybody else, and also to supplement the devices we had, we used BrowserStack. We chose BrowserStack because we already had an account with them and had a good relationship with them. So we made sure that we had enough licenses for anyone who wanted one. And so that's not only the testers, but also the developers, also the product people, anybody who would need to try out the application on a mobile device could get that license. And I created detailed documentation to help teams get started with the BrowserStack testing, because sometimes it wasn't intuitive to them. And we worked with BrowserStack to get what's called dedicated devices. There were a couple of features. The main one was push notifications, where we needed to have test devices that only Paylocity owned, not the devices that are in the cloud that we might use and then somebody else might use. We needed to have devices that specifically belonged to us. So we worked with them to get 4 dedicated devices to test with as well. And that was really helpful. Okay, next slide. So next step was plans and procedures. So we've got the people, we've got the tools in place. Now we're going to figure out how we're going to test. Next slide. So the first thing that I did was I updated our existing smoke tests. So for our existing app, we had 3 levels of smoke tests that we would use depending on what the level of risk was. So we had a level 0, level 1, level 2. I upgraded those so that we could use those on our new app. Level 0 was very, very basic. Log in, do a punch, use the nav bar and menu, and then navigate to the profile screen. Those are the big ticket items that we need to make sure work. Level 1 smoke test was all of those above things, plus we wanted to smoke test all of the new native features. For example, punch was in native, chat was in native. So we would do some additional testing on those. And then level 2 was all of the above, plus a smoke test of all the non-native features. So things that were still in a portal, like for example, the expense pages were still in the portal. So we would want to make sure to just be able to go to the page, load the page, and do one thing in the app. Okay, next slide. So the next thing I did was I updated the existing regression tests. So we had 3 suites of regression tests that were the most important things. First, we have login. Obviously, if you can't log into the application, you can't use it. So we had a login regression suite. And so that tested things like biometric login, single sign-on login, multi-factor login, and auto login. And then we had new user registration. We get new users all the time because we get new customers, and then they get new employees, and those new employees want to be able to use the app. So we would go through the new registration process, making sure that the users could get an auth code, that they were recognized in the system, and then through creating a username and password, and then making sure that they can log in. And then our third big feature is punch. We have millions of users who punch in and out every single day. So very, very important, especially to those people, because if they can't punch in, they can't get paid. So we tested things like adding a note and photo, which are sometimes required for punch, answering attestation questions. Sometimes employees have to answer, do you have a fever, before they report to work. And then things like punching inside and outside of a geofence. A geofence is like a software barrier that gets put around a location on a map, and the user can only punch in if they're actually inside the geofence. So that keeps people from punching in when they're really down the street. So we had regression tests for all of those features, and I updated them all so that they would reflect what was in the new app. Okay, next slide. So then I created test users. It was very important that we have lots of different users to test with so that we could exercise all the scenarios. So we had a bunch of users with different login scenarios, such as what if their password is expired? What if their challenge questions aren't set? We had users who hadn't registered yet, so we could practice registering them. I created 15 different punch users, all that had different kinds of configurations, because there were so many combinations of punch rules. Some companies require the user to have a photo, some don't, some require them to answer attestation questions, some don't. So I made 15 with a whole bunch of different combinations. And then we also tested users who don't have a feature enabled. So for example, if there's a user from a company that doesn't use punch, we needed to make sure that they could log in and that they weren't going to see a punch button to punch in. So we tested those things. So we had some users in those scenarios. And then I created users in every test environment from QA all the way through prod, to make sure that each time we were sort of moving up, like going into the staging environment or the corp environment, which I'll talk about later, and production, that we always had users to use for our testing. So those users, I kept them in wiki pages. They had login information for every single user, and usually some details about what it was that they could or could not do. And then I shared those with anybody who needed them, but especially our mobile test team and our mobile developers. Okay, next slide. So next I created a knowledge base wiki. Because Paylocity is a big company with lots of different features, it's been around for a long time, more than 20 years. Sometimes there are configuration things that only one or two people know how to do. So when I find out about those things, I like to document them so that everybody else knows how to do them too. So one of the biggest things was the punch features. There were a lot of punch features, as I mentioned, and they, interestingly, in the app, in the web app, you could log in as an admin and you could turn on and off the various features, but they were in 3 different locations, actually 4 different locations in the application. So you might enable one feature on this page, but then you'd have to go to a completely different page to enable another feature. So I wanted to make sure that those were documented really well. I also had instructions about how to configure various login scenarios, like what could you do in the database to make this user's password expired, so that then when they logged in, they would have to create a new password. And then information on how to test some of the other obscure features, also where to find email notifications, because some of the events in our mobile app will trigger an email notification, so people needed to know where to look for that. So that knowledge base wiki was made available to everybody on the mobile team and also outside the mobile team as well. Next slide. So then I created a process document for our mobile testers, because I wanted to make sure that we were all doing things the same way. It just makes it easier to avoid confusion and also to help support our developers. So the process document outlined how to create and organize test plans, how to execute and complete those test plans, how to log a bug, what kinds of details you need to put in there, and then also how to validate bug fixes to make sure that we were testing those well. So that was shared with the team. Everybody knew where to find it. Next slide. Then we also wanted to make sure that we could stay in touch. So we are spread out not only all over the United States, but we now have developers and testers in the Czech Republic as well. So we wanted to make sure that we could stay in touch. So I created a Slack channel just for the mobile testers where we could talk about things and I could give them updates about what was happening with the project. We also had Slack channels for communicating with the developers and with product owners and with feature teams as well, like if we had a question for a specific feature team. Then I set up a monthly meeting just for the software testers on mobile, and where we could talk about any issues. And then I made that meeting alternate between an early meeting and a late meeting so that we could accommodate our different time zones, because we had a time zone difference of 9 hours between our tester in California and our tester in the Czech Republic. And then we had conversations, live video conversations in Teams. If anyone ever had a question, they could call me up. We could talk. They could share their screen. I could see what they were seeing. So that was really helpful as well. Okay, next slide. So now we go to part 5, feature team participation. This was extremely important because, as I've mentioned, this was a gigantic app and lots of feature teams, 25 feature teams had stuff in the app. Okay, next slide. So I'll explain a little bit about the difference between the mobile teams and the feature teams and what they were doing. So the mobile teams, those testers were the ones who were testing the native iOS and Android elements, menus and navigation, the new API that was calling the existing APIs, device-specific integrations, and memory and caching, like especially with logging in and logging out. The feature teams, these are the teams who have stuff in the app, but they're not actually writing native mobile code. And so they have specific features such as chat or time off or expense that is in the web app and it's also in the mobile app. So they needed to make sure that they were testing their stuff in the mobile app. Also team-specific APIs that we might be calling, they would need to test those. The existing Ionic app screens, they're going to know the Ionic app screens better than we are, so that make sure that everything looks okay. And then they have domain-specific knowledge about how their product is supposed to work that we often don't have. So that's how we tried to divide up the testing. Okay, next slide. So I made a testing schedule for the feature team so that they would understand exactly when we were going to be expecting them to test. So in the QA environment, 6 months before release, we sort of unveiled the app for all of those feature teams to test. And it was a good thing we did because we found lots and lots and lots of bugs. I think it was something like 450 bugs. It was a lot of bugs. And so then, the next phase was bug fixes. While the bugs were being fixed, we would usually ask the person who found the bug to do a retest to make sure that it was working correctly for them now. So then about 3 months before the release, we had everybody test in our staging environment. And then 2 months before release, we had them test in our corp environment. And I'll explain what that is. As Paylocity employees, we use the application just the same way all of our customers do because we need to get paid. We need to ask for time off. So we have all of our testers, all of our feature testers were testing in that corp environment. And then finally, 1 month before release, we had them all testing in the production environment. Next slide. Okay, so next thing we needed to do was ask all of the teams to create a test plan. Now, you might be wondering, we had an old app, and the old app is still existing and was still being released every month. Weren't the feature teams testing in the old app? Yes, they were, but they weren't always testing very extensively, which meant that there were a lot of bugs in the old app. So we wanted to make sure that we could find and fix as many of those apps as we could. And actually, I'll mention in a later slide, sometimes we had to not fix existing bugs. So if they found a bug that was in the new app that was also in the old app, sometimes we said, you know what, we don't have time to fix that. It's in the old app and nobody's screaming, so we'll fix that after our initial release. But we wanted to make sure that they were being a little more careful with their testing. So we asked each team to create a test plan. And the test plan needed to include things like what happens if the feature isn't enabled, notifications testing. So some of our features, if there's an action in the app, it triggers like an email or a push notification. So we wanted to make sure people were testing that. What about device-specific features such as the camera? Like, for example, the expense feature interacts with the camera to take pictures of receipts. So are they testing that? What about pulling to refresh a screen? And then we also wanted to make sure that they had test users for every environment, not just our QA environment. So we asked them to make a test plan with these features, and then those test plans went through 3 rounds of reviews. So the first round of reviews was me. I went through and I checked off, making sure that they had everything that should be in there. If they didn't, I would kick it back to them and have them improve it. Second round of review went to the mobile and one of the mobile engineering managers, and often he found things that I didn't find that were missing. And then the third round of reviews was they would go to another mobile tester other than me. And a lot of times they would think of things that I hadn't thought of yet. So after those 3 rounds, we felt like the feature teams had some good test plans that we could rely on moving forward. Okay, next slide. Then I created a testing wiki. And this was a document that was called Everything You Need to Know About Testing the New Mobile App. So that when feature teams went in and started to test, they would know exactly where to look for information, get all their questions answered. One of the things I included was working with BrowserStack, because some teams had never worked with BrowserStack before. We had a different cloud provider before we switched over to BrowserStack, and so for a time we had both that were enabled. So some people were familiar with the old one. And then I also discussed the differences in behavior between the old app and the new app, because the new app had native features. Some of the behaviors, especially when testing in BrowserStack, were different. So I wanted to outline that for people. And then that saved them having to ask me questions over and over again. Okay, next slide. So as we were getting close to each round of testing, I would make sure to send out reminders to everybody so that they knew it was happening, so they wouldn't be surprised when suddenly they had a deadline. So usually from about 2 weeks before, I would say, hey, it's almost time to start testing. And then each test round had a sign-off sheet with a deadline. So start testing now, be done by the end of the week, make sure to sign off. As I mentioned earlier, the goal was feature parity, not a bug-free app, because there were some existing bugs. But if they found anything that was working in the old app and was not working in the new app, they would log it and we would prioritize that immediately. And we created a template to help the testers log the bugs so that they would have to include things like what version were you using, were you testing on Android or iOS, and what user were you logging in with when you saw the bug. And then we had a Slack channel that was available so that anybody could ask questions at any time. Okay, next slide. Part 6, rollout considerations. So now we're getting ready to actually roll out the application to real users. So next slide. The first thing we did was we tested the upgrade. We wanted to make sure that a user who had the old app could upgrade to the new app and all of their settings would be saved. It would remember their login, or if they had biometric login set up, it would remember that. So we tested that extensively. And then we also decided we ought to have a rollback plan in case we rolled out the application and there was some big disaster and we needed to roll back. So We also tested rolling back. So we would do the old app, upgrade to the new app, then downgrade back to the old app and make sure that all of the settings were still there. Okay, next slide. So you may have heard in software development, there's an expression called eating our own dog food, which is basically where the software team is trying out the application for themselves. We at Paylocity like to use the phrase drinking our own wine instead, because that's more appetizing than eating our own dog food. So the first thing we did was we drank our own wine. We first offered the opportunity to all of the technology teams to sign up to use the app via Firebase or TestFlight and try it out and start using it for their day-to-day usage of the app. And that was great because we found some good bugs that way. And then the next thing we did was we invited a subset of the company, sort of randomly chosen users to try out the app. And then eventually we expanded it to the entire company. So anyone in the company could use the app. And that was really great for finding other bugs as well, because for example, punch users in the technology team, we don't have any real world punch users, but elsewhere in the company, there are punch users. And so they were able to use the app and find some good bugs for us. Okay, next slide. So rollout part 2 was early adopters. So we had 2 companies who were heavy punch users who signed up to be early adopters of the application. So they started out, and then gradually over the course of a few weeks, more companies were added. And this was actually really, really helpful because we found one big bug that we missed. So I'm so happy that we did this. So yeah, that was very useful, and useful to find it when everyone understood that it was an early adoption. Okay, next slide. So now we go into rollout part 3, which is general availability. So we decided we were going to release the iOS app first. And the reason why we did that was because when we first started the project, the iOS team was hired before the Android team. So they were always a little bit ahead of the project. So we decided they were a little bit more ready to go to general availability. So we rolled out to 1% of users on September 14th. So yes, that was just a week ago. We did that. So that was very, very exciting when we rolled out. And as of today, we have gone to 2%. And we now have, let's see, this morning we had 70,000 users. And things are going really, really well so far. So far, there have been some bugs found, but they've been obscure bugs like there were some people who had like an item missing from a table in a database. So things that I'm not feeling like, oh gosh, we should have caught that. So really, really happy about that. We're gradually increasing the rollout over the next 3 weeks. So 3 weeks from now, we should be at 100% on iOS. And the Android release is starting at the end of September. And that's going to be a shorter release schedule. We're going to roll out over the course of 1 week. Okay, next slide. So what's next for us? Well, now we need to start thinking about some UI automation. We wanted to be doing that before now, but we were so slammed with work, both the developers and the testers, that we were only able to get a little bit of an iOS framework in place. So right now we have about 20 tests in place for iOS, and we're going to start adding to those soon. Pretty soon, the Android developers are going to help us make an Android native test framework, and then we will start adding to that. We also have some fast follow features. There were things that teams wanted to get into our release where we were like, we just do not have time to get that in on time. So those are coming up next. We are also hoping that gradually all of the feature teams will update their existing portal features to be native as well, so that eventually we will have a completely native app. And we also want to keep on working on having that clear delineation between the responsibilities of the mobile teams and the feature teams in terms of testing. Okay, next slide. So that's all I have for you today. I'm looking forward to taking your questions. Just as a reminder, my book's called The Complete Software Tester, and you can find it on Amazon. My Monday morning automation YouTube show you can find at my Thinking Tester YouTube channel. My Postman Essential Training course is on LinkedIn Learning. My blog can be found at thinkingtester.com. You can also connect with me on LinkedIn or on X, formerly known as Twitter. Thanks.
Amazing. Perfect. We have a lot of questions, I think. Yeah, I can see. That is amazing. Okay, Gunesh, very active member of our community. I can see a lot of community members asking questions. I'm very happy. Okay, Gunesh is asking how to make wikis effective. Usually documentations are forgotten or not referenced and not updated. People always tend to reach out to the author most times.
That's a great question. Yeah, I agree. Like a lot of times documentation gets out of date. One of the things that I try to do is I try to make my documentation as simple as possible so that I won't need to go back in and change something. So I'm not thinking in terms of documenting for, an end user or documenting even for a product person. I'm thinking of documenting for a tester. So I know the things that the tester already knows how to do. So I try to keep those steps simple because I figure, oh, the tester already knows how to log into the web app. The tester already knows how to get to this page. So that's one thing. The other thing I did was I tried to name all of the articles that I made in a way that it would be easy to search. So for example, instead of writing like configuring a punch user, I would write punch user configuration. And then I alphabetized all of the articles so that if somebody says, and actually even me, because I go back and I look at my own wiki to try and remember, how do I configure a punch user? So I know I need to search for punch first. So I go down the list and I find the P for punch, and then I see the article that I want. So that's something else I did.
Perfect. Ganesh, I have one more question. 3 iterations of test plans feels time consuming. How does it work in fast paced environments?
It was time consuming. It was crazy time consuming. And it would definitely not be something that I would recommend you do like on a daily basis. This was a one-time thing because we needed to get as much information as possible from the feature teams about what it was that they were going to test. So I needed to be able to look at these test plans and say, this person has a notification feature as part of their page. This person has pull to refresh as part of their page. So it was extremely time consuming for me because I had to review those 25 test plans. It probably took me about a week to do, and just sort of focused on solely that. But once those plans were in place, like now that we have, started releasing the app, if we need to go back and say, oh, we need to have the expense team retest again, we can go back and we can look and see what they have already. And we can also start incorporating it into our existing test case management system, which we just started to use.
Perfect. I hope, Gunesh, that answers your question. Next question is asked by Tara. He's asking, are we as a testers responsible for creating knowledge base wiki? I think this should came from requirements and then doc team.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. That is where it should come from. And I'm going to be very honest. We had a situation at our company where it seemed to me anyway, that there were only like 1 or 2 people in the company that understood how the punch feature was configured. And so because of that, we had to get that information. We didn't have time to be like, hey, product person from the punch team, can you please create extensive documentation for us so that we can know what to do? So if we were going to get this done and if we were going to get it done right, and I am happy to say that the Punch users who are using the new app, we have 50% fewer errors now than in the old app. And I think that's a function of we needed to figure out how this stuff worked, even if it wasn't our job, and then document it so that we knew how to test it properly.
Amazing. Saptrishi is asking, so in order to validate the password and make it expire, did you integrate your test with Mango, any DB tool? Do you, DB tool you use?
No, I do. This was a manual process. When I created the login test users, some of them I could kind of set up and just have them be set up and not have to do any steps. Like for example, I've got a test user whose name is Forgetful Fanny, and she always forgets her password. So I've got her all set up. It doesn't matter what her password is because she's forgotten it. So she can just go in and say that she's forgotten her password and go through the steps. For somebody who has like an expired password, that's just a simple SQL query to run. And since we don't have to test that feature very often, I just put in instructions about here's how to do it. Go into the database, run this query, and you're good to go. It's not something that we test every day because we do have a team, the user access team. It's really their job to be testing these login features all the time.
Awesome. Tara is having one more question. Why is it always a hurdle to increase members in the QA team? How can we ask more members, or what strategies we can apply to do more with less members?
If I knew the answer to that question, I would be really, really grateful because we are still struggling with it right now. Like literally right before this meeting, I was in a conversation with the new mobile director and she was asking, we need more resources. What are we going to do? How can we do it? The only answer I have is metrics. And at Paylocity, we are getting better at starting to be able to measure metrics like how long does it take for a feature to go from being ready for development into being released. And so as we adopt those metrics, I'm really hoping that we will be able to use those metrics to say, you can see that we're missing a testing resource. We need to have another one.
Amazing. Next question is, how much of automation you include while doing all the this huge projects in less amount of time?
Yeah, well, the short answer is we didn't do much automation at all. The only automation that we did was we did API automation. Earlier in the project, I was the one who was doing some of the back-end API testing. And so I had a bunch of manual tests created in Postman. And then when, I mentioned earlier, we finally got a tester from another team to join us. And when he joined us, the first thing I asked him to do was, can you please automate all of these tests that I made? And he had done that before. So he said, oh, sure, no problem. But for the native UI testing, we didn't have anybody with experience with that. So we decided this is going to have to wait until after our initial release. And that's why we're working on it now.
Awesome. So my next question is, any kind of security testing was done?
Oh, yeah, this is a great question. We actually, so one of the things I always like to do for security testing is just permissions, like who has permission to do what. And I did a lot of security testing around the APIs too. What happens if you call the API without the appropriate token, that kind of thing. So I did a lot of that. We did have a security audit done. We've got an internal security team at Paylocity, and we used them, and we also hired an outside security team to do an audit. And I am very happy to say they basically found no issues. So that was really, really awesome.
Awesome. Like Christine mentioned in the prior question, like you about the API testing, guys. Just a plugin. Like if you want to learn about API testing with Postman, okay, we are having a course. Shashank have posted the poll. Make sure if you want to learn, just tap yes, okay, and I'll reach out to you. My guys, I'll only take three more questions. Okay, then we will wrap it up. I just saw one more question. So Syed is asking, how can a newcomer to this field effectively contribute to a project with the same deadline?
Well, I'll tell you what Srinivas did. He was our contractor who we hired to work on the project for 6 months, and he made himself so useful that like 1 month into the project, I was advocating every single time I met with the testing or with the software managers. I said, we need to hire this guy. We need to hire this guy, and that was he he was very, very careful. He was a very careful learner. He asked a lot of really good questions. So when I gave him a test plan and I said, here, try out this test plan and see if you can run it, if he saw something that didn't match exactly what the specification was, he would ask me about it. And because of that, he found so many good bugs. So I would say just, be a good observer, ask good questions, make sure if you learn something new, make sure to like write it down somewhere so that you don't have to ask the same questions over and over again. I think those would be excellent ways to make yourself indispensable.
Awesome. Uh, Next question is, loved how meticulous your plan was, but one big challenge is for projects that take only 3 months before release. Any advice for such test planning?
Well, I think the most important thing is you need to communicate to management exactly what they're going to get with your time. So you could say to them, look, we've got 3 months. So in these 3 months, we will be able to get this level of testing done, but we will not be able to get this level of testing done. So if you are okay with that, that's what we're going to do. And then they might say, oh, no, I'm not okay with that. And then maybe the project will expand. But if not, just making sure that you've documented when you've said these things to somebody, make sure it's in a wiki page somewhere or in a document or something that everyone can refer back to. So if they say, well, why did you miss this bug? You can say, well, when I outlined the plan I was going to do, I mentioned that we were not going to have time to find X. And X is where the bug was. So then they know.
Awesome. I think, guys, that was the last question for this session. Christine, any closing thoughts and how are you feeling?
Oh, well, I feel great. I'm so happy that this was well attended and that I got lots of great questions. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn if you had more questions that didn't get answered. I would be happy to answer them as soon as I have time. So we can keep the conversation going.
Yeah. Perfect. And there's one ritual, Christine, which I started in the community, which is basically whenever we say bye from the session or whenever you are meeting a tester, whenever you say bye, instead of saying bye, say happy testing. Okay.
Okay.
So yeah, you can see my community members saying happy testing. Thank you very much, guys. Just type happy testing in the chat, and I will see you in the next session. Thank you very much, guys. Lovely hosting you, and lots of really good questions we saw tonight. Thank you very much, Christine.
Thanks and happy
Bye,
testing.
guys. Happy testing.